The crowd was already on its feet before the race even began. 40,000 voices blended into a thunderous wave of excitement rolling across the racetrack like an approaching storm. Cameras flashed. Announcers spoke in rising tones. The smell of dust, leather, and anticipation hung thick in the air. This wasn't just another championship race. This was the race everyone had been waiting for all season. But no one, not a single soul in that roaring stadium, could have predicted that the most unforgettable moment in racing history would begin with complete and total stillness. Inside starting gate number 6 stood a horse that didn't belong there. At least, that's what many believed. His name was Valor. Valor was massive, deep-chested, with a dark copper coat that shimmered under the late afternoon sunlight. His muscles rippled like coiled steel beneath his skin. Even from the stands, people could see he was built for speed, built for dominance. Yet something about him always made spectators uneasy. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was something harder to explain. A quiet intensity in his eyes, as if he were constantly listening to a world no one else could hear. And right now, he wasn't moving. The other horses stomped, snorted, and pawed at the dirt. They were restless, energized, desperate for the gates to explode open. Their riders leaned forward, gripping reins, whispering commands, preparing for the violent surge of speed that would follow the starting bell. But Valor stood completely still. Not shifting. Not trembling. Not reacting. Just staring forward. The jockey on his back, Daniel Reyes, felt the tension immediately. Daniel had ridden dozens of elite racehorses throughout his career, and he prided himself on understanding their instincts. Horses were emotional creatures. Sensitive, reactive, honest. But Valor was different. Ever since Daniel had been assigned to ride him 3 months ago, he had felt like he was working with a force of nature rather than an animal. Daniel leaned slightly closer to Valor's neck, lowering his voice into the calmest whisper he could manage. "Easy, boy, we've got this." But Valor didn't flick an ear. He didn't twitch a muscle. From the sidelines, stable caretaker Eleanor Brooks pressed her hands together tightly against her chest. Eleanor had raised Valor since the day he arrived at the rescue ranch nearly 4 years earlier. She knew his past better than anyone, a past she rarely spoke about. She could feel something was wrong. And deep down, she feared she knew why. 4 years ago, Valor had been discovered wandering near an abandoned training facility. He had been skeletal, dehydrated, and covered in old scars that suggested he had been pushed far beyond his limits during his early training years. Authorities believed he had been discarded after a severe track accident that killed his original rider. No official records ever confirmed it, but Eleanor had spent enough time around traumatized horses to recognize the signs. Valor carried memories in his muscles. Memories that sometimes surfaced when pressure closed in around him. And now, as Eleanor watched him standing frozen inside that narrow metal starting gate, her stomach twisted with dread. The announcer's voice echoed across the stadium. Riders ready, horses set. The crowd roared louder. Daniel adjusted his grip on the reins. He could feel Valor's heartbeat through the saddle, steady, powerful, but strangely distant, like a drum echoing from another room. Daniel gently nudged his heels against Valor's sides, giving him the subtle signal they had practiced hundreds of times during training. Nothing. The horse remained frozen. A murmur rippled through the crowd as spectators began noticing the delay. Television cameras zoomed in, capturing the unusual stillness of the giant thoroughbred surrounded by frantic movement. Social media feeds exploded instantly with speculation. Was the horse injured? Was he refusing to race? Officials along the track began exchanging nervous glances. Delays at this level of competition were rare and expensive. Every second stretched the tension tighter. Daniel swallowed hard. His pulse began racing. He leaned down again, this time pressing his forehead briefly against Valor's mane, a gesture no one in the audience could see, but one Eleanor recognized immediately from the sidelines. Daniel wasn't commanding him anymore. The stadium fell into a strange, electric hush. 1 second before the gates were scheduled to explode open. Valor lowered his head slightly. Daniel felt it. The smallest shift. The faintest tremor running through the horse's shoulders. Hope flickered inside him, fragile, dangerous, and desperate. Then suddenly, Valor's entire body locked even tighter than before, and the bell began to ring. But Gate 6 didn't move. The gates for every other horse burst open in a synchronized explosion of metal and motion. Dirt flew into the air as 11 elite racehorses launched forward in a blur of speed and thunder. But Valor remained inside the gate, standing still, while the entire race surged ahead without him. Gasps erupted across the stadium. Commentators stumbled over their words in shock. Officials shouted into radios. Cameras zoomed in frantically, broadcasting the unbelievable moment to millions of viewers around the world. Daniel's heart pounded violently against his ribs as the thunder of hooves faded farther down the track. He was losing the race. He was losing his chance at redemption. And worst of all, he could feel Valor slipping deeper into whatever memory had trapped him. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, inhaled deeply, and whispered something into Valor's ear, words no microphone would ever capture. From the sidelines, Eleanor froze mid-step as she watched Daniel's lips move. Because she knew exactly what he had just told him. And if it worked, history wouldn't just be made by speed. It would be made by trust. Daniel's voice barely rose above the distant thunder of hooves pounding the track ahead. The race was already unfolding without them, the other horses stretching into full sprint as dirt sprayed into the air like shrapnel behind them. The crowd's roar had shifted into a confused, chaotic mixture of cheers and gasps. But inside Gate 6, the world felt strangely sealed off, like time had slowed just for the two of them. Daniel pressed his cheek gently against Valor's neck, his gloved hand loosening slightly on the reins. "You're safe," he whispered. The words were simple, almost fragile. But Daniel didn't say them for performance or training technique. He said them because he believed Valor needed to hear them, not as commands, but as truth. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then Valor exhaled. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow, heavy release of breath that rippled through his entire body. Daniel felt the tension beneath him soften by a fraction, so small most riders wouldn't have noticed. But Daniel had spent months learning every subtle language hidden in this horse's movements. He knew that breath meant Valor was listening. From the sideline, Eleanor stopped moving. Her eyes widened as she gripped the railing. She had seen therapists use similar grounding techniques on traumatized rescue horses. Soft reassurance, calm physical presence. But she had never seen it attempted in the middle of a championship race with global cameras watching every second. Behind them, officials shouted into radios, debating whether to disqualify Gate 6 completely. Racing rules were strict. Delays could jeopardize fairness. Sponsors, broadcasters, and race coordinators were already panicking as the gap between Valor and the rest of the field widened with every passing second. Inside the gate, Daniel knew he had maybe one last chance. He loosened the reins further, an unorthodox move that would horrify most trainers. Releasing rein pressure meant surrendering control. It meant trusting the horse completely. "Hey," Daniel murmured softly, his voice trembling just enough to carry genuine emotion. "You don't have to run for them. You run when you're ready." Valor's ears twitched. A small movement, but Eleanor gasped softly from the sidelines. That twitch meant recognition, awareness, the beginning of connection. Inside Valor's mind, memories flickered like broken film reels, metal gates slamming, crowds screaming, the sickening echo of an accident he never fully understood. Years earlier, the chaos of a catastrophic crash had burned itself into his instincts. Horses didn't process trauma like humans did. They carried it in muscle memory, in survival responses, in silent reflexes that surfaced when environments felt threatening. The narrow metal gate, the noise, the pressure, it all pulled him backward into fear. But Daniel's voice, it didn't push. It waited. Valor shifted his weight slightly, hooves scraping against the dirt. Daniel felt it immediately, his pulse spiking with cautious hope. He resisted the instinct to urge him forward. One wrong signal could snap the fragile trust forming between them. Instead, he exhaled slowly, matching Valor's breathing rhythm. Out on the track, the race was approaching its halfway point. The lead horses were already rounding the far turn, muscles straining, jockeys crouched low as they fought for position. Commentators scrambled to keep up with both the race and the unbelievable situation unfolding at the gate. And folks, we are witnessing something unprecedented here. Gate 6 remains closed. The horse Valor has yet to leave the starting line. Social media feeds exploded with speculation. Some viewers assumed injury. Others criticized the delay. But a surprising number began noticing the unusual stillness between horse and rider, a quiet moment of communication happening in plain sight. Back inside the gate, Valor lifted his head slightly. Daniel's breath caught. Valor blinked slowly, nostrils flaring as he drew in the scent of dirt, sweat, and sun-warmed leather. His muscles trembled, but this time it wasn't fear alone. It was conflict, the battle between instinct and trust. Eleanor pressed her palm against her mouth, tears beginning to form. She remembered the night Valor first arrived at the rescue ranch. He had refused food, water, and human contact for nearly 48 hours straight. Every sudden noise sent him into panic. Every attempt to guide him resulted in frozen resistance or explosive retreat. Until one quiet evening, Eleanor had simply sat outside his stall for hours, humming softly, refusing to rush him. Eventually, Valor had stepped closer. Just one step. And it had changed everything. Now she was watching that same fragile miracle happen again. Only this time, millions were watching alongside her. Inside the gate, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice barely audible. "You remember the open fields, don't you? The wind, the freedom. You showed me that, remember?" Valor's ears flicked again, forward this time. Another breath. Another tremor. And then he stepped forward. Just one step. The metal gate creaked softly as his weight shifted against the barrier. Daniel felt adrenaline surge through him, but he forced himself to remain calm. The last thing Valor needed was sudden excitement. From the control booth, officials shouted in shock. One quickly signaled to the gate operator to prepare for release if the horse showed forward commitment. The stadium crowd, noticing movement, began erupting into rising waves of astonished cheers. Valor paused again. Daniel's heart hammered painfully as doubt tried creeping into his mind. The race was already far ahead. Logic screamed that even if Valor started now, victory would be impossible. But Daniel wasn't thinking about winning anymore. He was thinking about healing, about trust, about proving that this horse wasn't broken, just unheard. Daniel lowered his voice one final time. "No matter what happens next, I'm with you." Valor's entire body shuddered. Then suddenly, with a powerful surge of motion, he lunged forward against the gate. The operator reacted instantly. Gate 6 exploded open. Dust burst into the air as Valor launched onto the track, hooves slamming against the dirt with explosive force. Daniel leaned forward instinctively, gripping lightly but allowing Valor to find his own rhythm. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything the stadium had ever heard. The noise surged from confusion into thunderous disbelief as the delayed horse burst into motion with raw, unstoppable energy. But the race was nearly 3/4 finished. Valor was last by a staggering distance. Commentators shouted over one another in astonishment. "He's finally out. Valor has left the gate, but he has an impossible amount of ground to cover." Daniel could feel the horse beneath him transforming. The hesitation was gone. The tension had shifted into something fierce, determined, almost defiant. Valor stretched into full stride, muscles firing with explosive coordination. Dirt flew behind them as they began devouring the track length with breathtaking acceleration. From the sidelines, Eleanor collapsed onto the railing, sobbing openly now, not from fear, but from pride. Because she knew what most of the world didn't. Valor wasn't running to win. He was running because he trusted someone enough to try again. And as they rounded the first turn, something unexpected began happening. They were closing the gap. Valor's hooves struck the dirt like thunderclaps echoing across the track, each stride longer and more powerful than the last. The stadium, moments earlier buzzing with confusion, now erupted into a roaring wave of disbelief as spectators leaned forward in their seats, trying to comprehend what they were witnessing. The giant screen replayed the moment Gate 6 had finally burst open, showing Valor launching forward with a force that looked less like racing and more like liberation. Daniel crouched low against Valor's neck, his heart pounding in rhythm with the horse's accelerating stride. The wind whipped past them, tugging at his sleeves, blurring the cheers of the crowd into a distant roar. He wasn't pushing Valor anymore. He wasn't urging him faster with heels or reins. Instead, Daniel rode in near-perfect stillness, allowing Valor to choose the pace, to find his own confidence in every stretch of the track ahead. And Valor was choosing speed. Ahead of them, the lead pack thundered toward the final curve. 11 elite racehorses, each bred, trained, and conditioned for dominance, were already fighting for position. Dirt sprayed backward in violent bursts as jockeys leaned dangerously low, shouting commands and calculating moves with split-second precision. Valor was still last. But the gap between him and the trailing horse began shrinking, not gradually, but aggressively. Within seconds, he overtook the 12th-place runner, sliding past with a fluid burst of motion that drew shocked gasps from commentators. Ladies and gentlemen, Valor is moving, and moving incredibly fast. The crowd's energy shifted from curiosity to electric anticipation. Phones lifted into the air as thousands of spectators began recording what felt like the beginning of something impossible. The broadcast cameras cut repeatedly between the leading horses and the dark copper blur charging up from behind. Inside the saddle, Daniel felt a transformation he had never experienced in his entire career. Valor's stride wasn't desperate or frantic. It was smooth, controlled, purposeful. The horse moved like he had been waiting years for this exact moment. But Daniel knew the truth ran deeper than racing instinct. Valor wasn't chasing victory. He was chasing freedom from fear. As they approached the far curve, Daniel noticed a subtle shift in Valor's breathing, faster now, but steady, confident. It was the same rhythm Daniel had felt during their best training runs back at the ranch, during those quiet early mornings when it was just the two of them galloping across open pasture fields with no crowds, no pressure, and no expectations. Suddenly, Daniel raised two fingers briefly off the reins, a tiny, almost invisible gesture. Most viewers never noticed. But someone watching from the stands did. Near the upper tier, an elderly man wearing a weathered ranch jacket leaned forward sharply, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the giant stadium screen. His name was Thomas Calder. Few people in the racing world recognized him anymore, but decades earlier, he had been one of the most respected horse behavioral specialists in the country. And he recognized that signal instantly. Thomas whispered under his breath, barely audible even to himself. He remembered. Back on the track, Valor surged past another competitor. The crowd exploded into fresh cheers as he climbed into 10th place. Dirt kicked into the air behind him like smoke trailing from a rocket launch. Daniel's hands remained steady, giving only subtle directional guidance, allowing Valor's instincts to guide the momentum. But the real battle was still ahead. The leading pack was entering the final stretch, the straightaway that would decide everything. The stadium rose collectively to its feet as the announcer's voice climbed into near hysterical excitement. Valor is closing in, but he still has an incredible distance to make up. This could be the most dramatic comeback we have ever seen. Eleanor clutched the railing so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Tears streamed freely down her face, but she couldn't look away. Every step Valor took felt like watching years of healing unfold in seconds. Memories flashed through her mind, late nights tending to his injuries, quiet mornings brushing his coat while whispering reassurance, moments when she feared he would never trust humans again. And now he was trusting one enough to carry him into history. As Valor entered the final straightaway, Daniel felt something shift again beneath him. The horse lowered his head slightly, stretching his neck forward, a sign of maximum speed engagement. His muscles fired in perfect harmony, each stride eating massive portions of track with terrifying efficiency. They surged into 8th place, then 7th. The crowd's noise became deafening. People screamed, pointed, cried, laughed, and shouted Valor's name as if willing him forward through pure emotion alone. But the leaders were still far ahead. The finish line loomed dangerously close. 3 horses remained ahead. The leaders were locked in brutal competition, pushing their mounts to absolute limits, unaware of the unstoppable force closing in behind them. Daniel leaned closer to Valor's neck, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're doing it. You're really doing it." Valor responded with another explosive burst of speed. 3rd place. The crowd's screams became deafening, echoing across the stadium like rolling thunder. Cameras zoomed in on Daniel's face, capturing the disbelief and raw emotion flooding his expression. Millions of viewers around the world leaned closer to their screens, hearts pounding in unison with the galloping rhythm. Only 2 horses remained ahead now, and the finish line was rushing toward them faster than anyone could breathe. Daniel tightened his focus, whispering one final phrase into Valor's ear, a phrase he had never used during training, a phrase Eleanor had once told him only meant one thing to Valor. It meant run without fear. Valor's ears shot forward sharply. His muscles coiled. And just as they reached the final 50 yards, he launched into a stride that would be talked about for generations. The finish line stood ahead like a glowing horizon, white and unforgiving beneath the blazing afternoon sun. The thunder of hooves shook the earth as thousands of spectators screamed with voices that merged into a single, deafening roar. The air vibrated with tension so thick it felt almost electric, as if the entire stadium held its breath at once. Valor was flying. Daniel barely felt the saddle beneath him anymore. Every ounce of his focus locked onto the rhythmic surge of power rising and falling through the horse's body. Wind clawed past his face as the world blurred into streaks of color and sound. He could see the 2 remaining leaders ahead, their jockeys crouched low, whips flicking, urging their mounts into desperate bursts of speed. 40 yards remained. Valor's stride stretched impossibly longer, his muscles moving like perfectly synchronized machinery fueled by something deeper than training. Dirt exploded behind them with every thunderous impact of his hooves. His copper coat shimmered beneath the sunlight, glowing almost like fire as he devoured the distance separating him from the front runners. The crowd was no longer simply cheering. They were screaming in disbelief. Daniel felt his throat tighten as tears blurred the corners of his vision. He had ridden champions before. He had felt speed. He had tasted victory. But nothing compared to this moment. This wasn't about racing anymore. This was about witnessing a soul breaking free from its past. 30 yards. Valor surged forward again, overtaking the horse in 2nd place with a breathtaking burst of acceleration that sent gasps ripping through the stadium. For a split second, Daniel saw the rival jockey glance sideways in shock, his eyes widening as Valor stormed past like an unstoppable force. Now only 1 horse remained ahead. The reigning champion, Iron Crest, a stallion known for his unmatched finishing speed and ruthless competitive drive. Iron Crest's jockey leaned forward aggressively, pushing the horse into a final sprint that had crushed countless challengers throughout the season. 20 yards. Daniel could feel Valor's heartbeat pounding through his legs. The rhythm was thunderous, but steady, controlled, fearless. He leaned down, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "Whatever happens, I'm proud of you." Valor's ears flicked backward for a split second, not in fear, but recognition. Then something extraordinary happened. Valor accelerated again. The stadium erupted into chaos as he pulled alongside Iron Crest, their bodies racing neck and neck, muscles rippling, hooves striking the track in synchronized explosions of dirt and sound. Cameras flashed wildly. Commentators shouted words no one could fully understand through the storm of crowd noise. 10 yards. Daniel's breath caught as he felt Valor gather every remaining ounce of strength deep within his body. It felt like the horse was reaching beyond physical limits, tapping into something ancient, something instinctive, something emotional. 5 yards. Valor surged forward. For a single, breathtaking heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. And then he crossed the finish line. First, the stadium exploded into a tidal wave of disbelief, joy, and stunned silence all at once. Some spectators screamed. Others stood frozen, hands covering their mouths. Commentators shouted hysterically as replay screens flashed the historic moment from every possible angle. But Daniel wasn't celebrating. Because the instant Valor crossed the finish line, something changed. The horse slowed abruptly. Not gradually. Not smoothly. Abruptly. Daniel's heart lurched violently as he felt Valor's stride falter. The powerful rhythm that had carried them to victory shattered into uneven, staggering steps. The thunder of hooves faded into a frightening, unstable stumble as Valor's massive frame began swaying beneath him. Panic surged through Daniel's chest. "Whoa, easy, easy," he shouted, pulling gently on the reins while shifting his weight to stabilize them both. But Valor's breathing had changed, harsh, strained, uneven. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth as his legs trembled beneath him, struggling to maintain balance. The crowd's celebration faltered into confused murmurs as spectators noticed the sudden shift. The victory cheers slowly transformed into anxious silence spreading across the stadium like a chilling wave. Daniel's pulse pounded painfully in his ears as fear clawed through his thoughts. Racing pushed horses to physical extremes, and collapse after intense finishes was a devastating reality every rider feared but prayed never to witness. "Stay with me, stay with me," Daniel whispered desperately, sliding one foot free from the stirrup, preparing to dismount if necessary. From the sidelines, Eleanor's entire world collapsed into dread. The moment Valor staggered, she was already running. Security barriers, officials, and racing personnel blurred around her as she sprinted toward the track, her heart hammering violently in her chest. Memories crashed through her mind. The injured, frightened horse she had first met years ago, the long nights of recovery, the fragile trust they had built together piece by piece. Finally, the lead veterinarian stood, removing his gloves slowly. He exhaled deeply before speaking. "He's exhausted, severely overexerted, but he's stable." Eleanor collapsed forward, sobbing with overwhelming relief as Daniel closed his eyes, whispering a silent thank you to the horse who had trusted him with something far greater than victory. Around them, the stadium remained eerily silent, thousands of spectators witnessing not just a historic race, but a bond between human and horse that had carried them both beyond fear, beyond pain, and into a moment the world would never forget. But as medical teams carefully prepared to escort Valor off the track, one unexpected announcement echoed across the stadium speakers, an announcement that would change everything about what this victory truly meant. And Daniel felt his stomach twist as he realized. The greatest challenge was still ahead. The stadium remained suspended in an uneasy silence as medical crews carefully guided Valor toward the exit lane beside the track. The same crowd that had erupted into wild celebration only minutes earlier now watched with collective breath held tight in their chests. Victory banners still waved above the grandstands, but the mood had shifted from triumph to fragile concern. Daniel walked beside Valor, one hand resting gently along the horse's neck, matching his slower, exhausted steps. Eleanor remained on the other side, whispering soft reassurances between quiet tears. Every camera lens followed them, capturing the moment that felt far more emotional than any finish line photo ever could. Valor's head hung lower than usual, sweat darkening his coat as his powerful chest rose and fell with heavy effort. But his eyes, they remained alert, present. And every few steps, he leaned slightly toward either Daniel or Eleanor, as if drawing strength from their presence. As they reached the veterinary inspection area, officials approached with expressions that blended admiration and professional concern. The race director, a tall, silver-haired man known for his strict adherence to tradition, stepped forward slowly. "Daniel? Eleanor, that was the most extraordinary race this track has ever seen," he said quietly. "But we need to talk." Daniel felt tension creep into his shoulders. He had already sensed what this conversation might bring. Racing rules existed for a reason, and Valor's near collapse after such extreme exertion raised serious ethical and medical questions. The director glanced toward Valor before continuing. "After reviewing the veterinary reports and considering his history, we strongly recommend immediate retirement from professional racing." The words landed like a sudden storm cloud, heavy and unavoidable. Daniel's throat tightened. He had dreamed of championship titles his entire life. Riders chased careers defined by moments exactly like today, historic victories that built legends. And Valor had just delivered one of the greatest comebacks ever witnessed. But Daniel wasn't thinking about trophies. He looked at Valor, truly looked at him, and remembered the frozen stillness inside that starting gate. The whispered words. The fragile trust that had carried them forward. Eleanor wiped her tears slowly, her voice trembling but steady. "He's already given more than anyone ever expected from him," she said softly. Daniel nodded, placing his forehead gently against Valor's mane one more time. He didn't hesitate. "He's done racing," Daniel said firmly. The race director studied him for a long moment before nodding with quiet respect. "I thought you might say that." The official announcement echoed across the stadium speakers minutes later, explaining that Valor would be medically retired following his historic championship victory. The reaction from the crowd was unexpected. Instead of disappointment, a powerful wave of applause spread across the stands, thousands of spectators rising to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. People weren't cheering for another race. They were honoring a story, a journey, a bond that had reminded the world that strength wasn't just measured by speed, but by healing. Later that evening, inside the quiet stable far from cameras and flashing lights, Valor rested comfortably beneath warm blankets while veterinarians monitored his recovery. His breathing had returned to normal, and he accepted water and food slowly, regaining strength with every passing hour. Daniel sat on a wooden stool outside the stall, exhaustion finally catching up with him. His championship medal rested loosely in his palm, but he barely glanced at it. His attention remained locked on the horse calmly chewing hay inside. Eleanor approached quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Daniel before leaning against the stall door. "You know," she said gently, "most riders would have pushed him again next season, tried to chase more wins." Daniel smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I didn't save him today," he replied softly. "He saved me." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue. Daniel stared down at the medal, turning it slowly between his fingers. 3 years ago, I almost quit riding," he admitted. "I had a bad fall during a race. Not life-threatening, but it shattered my confidence. I kept racing, but every time I approached the starting gate, I felt fear creeping in. I just hit it better than most people could see." He looked back toward Valor. "Working with him, watching him fight his own fears, it forced me to face mine too." Eleanor smiled through lingering tears. "You two healed each other," she said. Weeks passed, and Valor's recovery became a story followed by millions around the world. Videos of his historic race spread across social media platforms, gathering emotional reactions from viewers who found inspiration in his journey. Messages poured in from fans sharing their own stories of overcoming trauma, rebuilding trust, and finding courage through unlikely partnerships. If this story touched you, moments like this remind people why compassion and patience can change lives, for both animals and humans. And if you enjoy stories that celebrate that bond, it helps more people discover them when you share or support the channel. But Valor's story wasn't finished. 3 months later, Daniel and Eleanor stood together at the gates of a newly opened rehabilitation ranch dedicated to injured and traumatized horses. The facility had been funded partly by prize winnings from the championship race and donations from viewers around the world who had been moved by Valor's journey. The ranch would focus on slow, trust-based recovery methods, the same patience and compassion that had saved Valor years earlier. As they opened the pasture gate, Valor stepped forward into a wide stretch of green fields glowing beneath the morning sunlight. He paused for a moment, lifting his head as wind brushed through his mane. Birds scattered across the sky above him while distant hills rolled endlessly toward the horizon. Then, without hesitation, he ran. Not in competition, not in fear, just in freedom. Daniel and Eleanor stood side by side, watching him gallop across the open field with powerful, effortless grace. Each stride looked lighter than the last, as if he were shedding the final remnants of his past with every step. Daniel exhaled slowly, emotion tightening his chest as he whispered quietly, "That's what winning really looks like." Valor slowed near the far side of the pasture, turning back toward them with ears forward and posture relaxed, not as a champion racehorse, but as a partner who had found peace. The camera of this story doesn't end with a finish line or roaring stadium. It ends with something quieter, something deeper. A horse who once stood frozen in fear. A rider who nearly lost his purpose. And a caretaker who refused to give up on either of them. Together, they created history, not just by winning a race, but by proving that trust, patience, and compassion can rewrite even the most broken past. And somewhere, in the wide open fields beneath the rising sun, Valor continues to run, not toward trophies or titles, but toward the life he finally earned.